Now that you've spent a good deal of time learning HTML and CSS, we want to broach the topic of responsive design. Up until now, we have done layouts in fixed pixel widths. Our divs were a certain number of pixels width, and that worked fine as long as we were working on a desktop computer that was a certain width or more, and we had a sense that our sites weren't going to get cut off. But if you're, on the web these days, if you're using devices like tablets or phones, even if you're on a desktop and you're sizing windows to different sizes on the screen, you are expecting to see a more responsive design, a more responsive layout that the site will take depending on what size it's being displayed at. The main elements are fluid layout, so we're going to establish percentage widths for our divs instead of pixel widths. Fluid images, so we're going to use some techniques that will allow us to size the images. And then media queries. And these are if all else fails with the percentages, we want to be able to have different breakpoints for sizes of devices, and we want special styles, special rules for certain sizes of the devices. And then the final thing that we'll talk about is the viewport, and that is a special code that you have to put in the head of your document so that an iPhone will not just shrink your site down from the desktop view of it and just show it on your iPhone, but will actually display the responsive design that you have created. So let's take a look at all of these methods and apply them to the site that we've already done, and you'll be able to get the code samples from the examples below. So the first thing we want to do is create a style sheet that has responsive styles in them. And I'm going to use the same HTML page that we've been using, index.html, that we were using for our previous site. So it already has the divs laid out for the header, the nav, the section, and the footer. We're not going to be doing anything different with that. But what we're going to be doing is modifying those things within the style sheet. Here I have the header div, and the only thing that's really different here is that instead of using a pixel width, I'm using a percentage. So for the header, 100% width. For the nav, 100% width. For the section, 100% width, and for the footer. So we're doing a pretty simple example here that's allowing us to apply a percent width. And then another thing that I like to do when I'm applying percent widths is to use a max width. We have some very, very large screens now that people are working on, and sometimes sites just don't look right at a very, very large size. This is a different problem than moving down to a smaller size. And quite often I'll establish a max width that just says don't stretch it any further than a certain pixel width. So in this case, I'm saying 1200px. You could apply something else if you wanted. You could leave that off, but I would definitely recommend seeing what your site looks like at very, very large sizes. So in this case, it's going to be a max width of 1200px. That means it will be responsive until 1200px, and then it will stop at that size. And because I have the margins established here, it will be centering. So if I apply this, and this is just style.css, so if we go back to the version where I was applying style.css to the site, we can just see what happens when we just apply the percent widths to a page. So I'll come over here and I'll refresh the page, make sure we have our percents applied, and as I make the site smaller, you can see, it's a little hard to see, but you can see the line here for the edge. You can see the rounded corner here that's following with it. It's not getting cut off. It's getting smaller and smaller, and it's reflecting a responsive layout. So the percentages are changing. Now the things that are not changing are the picture, and we don't have any different kind of a layout yet based on the smaller iPhone size layout. So the next thing we want to do is try to make the picture get smaller as we're getting into a smaller layout. And that's when we start talking about fluid images. The main thing we want to use for a fluid image is we want to establish that our images are at a max width of 100%. And so for our IMG, for any images on the page, we want to say the max width is 100%. And that just means it's not going to be any bigger than 100% of the container that contains it. It's not going to be cut off. It's not going to be overflowing. And in this case, I need to put that image. I'm going to use a special class. Remember that the special classes are indicated by these dots. I'm going to put the image in a special class that's going to be the only thing that's in this box called IMG box. And I'm going to make the width 30%. So no matter what size the screen is, this box will reduce to 30%, and then the image will never be larger than 100% of the box that contains it. Let's set it up inside the HTML where I have my image initially. Here's the image that I have on the site. So I want to put this inside that div with the class equal IMG box and close the div. And I don't have to do anything else because the regular IMG tag is getting the max width 100%. It's just basically saying any image on the site should not be any longer than 100% of the element that it's contained in. So if we look at this now and we come over here, we see that nothing is happening with this image. It's not sizing whatsoever. It's not changing. It might be okay, but we probably want it to get a little bit smaller when a user is looking at it on the screen. So if I save this page now and refresh, I should be able to see at a certain size the image getting smaller. And you can see a little bit of a change right there as it goes down. As the div that contains it, it becomes 30% of the screen size, which you can see that it is here. Then it stretches the image down just a tiny bit. This is very helpful when you have a dominating image. You see a lot of WordPress themes and Bootstrap themes that have a dominating image going across the top, and you definitely want that to size with the format of the page. So that's it. It's very simple. You just make sure you have the max width on your images at 100% and then put them in sort of a containing box that has a width percentage, and then the image will size down with that box. Now the next thing we want to do is to be able to apply media queries, and this is where responsive design becomes very, very powerful, because if you're not able to achieve the design you want with the percentage widths and with the fluid images, you can create special styles that only become activated at certain sizes. So what I have done is at the bottom of this style sheet, I've added a special rule for screen sizes where the max width is 550 px. So that means that when the size of the screen goes below 550 px, I'm going to have smaller font size, and this is going to be at a percent of my navigation items, because sometimes your navigation skips over to another line or gets cut off if you're using responsive design. And then I also want to not display my footer. I just want to be able to say none. Sometimes you don't want to show certain things in a responsive design environment. You feel like you don't want to use the limited real estate for that area. Sometimes you want to restack items in different ways. Maybe you have a sidebar on the side, and then that sidebar you want it to either not be displayed or to be displayed in a different place later on. And so you can do all that here. So notice that I opened up the rule and closed it here, and then I have all the styles that apply to it. And you can have multiple sizes that you're working with. Quite often when you're doing responsive design, you're starting with the smaller format and you're applying minimum widths and going up. But because we're using a page that we had already designed for the desktop, we're applying our media rules to scale it down. And so we're making the exceptions, the things that are different, be the things at the smaller sizes. So we could do a size that's more of a tablet size, and then we could do a smaller size for a smartphone, depending on what you wanted it to look like. And you will see these types of media queries at the end of style sheets when you're using a style sheet that is done by any sort of a framework like Bootstrap or a theme like WordPress. So if I apply this, and that's all I have to do is I just have to add them, and I can continue adding styles to this as long as I have styles that I want to change. And I'll come over here, let me stretch this out again, and we'll refresh it. So nothing really changes here until we get to the smaller size. And you can see that there was a small decrease in the size of the navigation items. And then you can also see where the footer just disappears. We decided at the iPhone size we don't want that. So again, keep in mind, you can do that for any div that you want on the page. Maybe you want a completely different div to show up at that point. So it can be hidden to begin with and then display later. Maybe you want your nav to show up a completely different way. There are many, many things that you can do when you start responsively designing a page. Now, the final thing that you want to do is just one thing that you need to add to any responsively designed page. In the head of your document, go to the top of the page, find the head section, and somewhere in the head, just include this meta tag, name equal viewport. That's just something that you have to have in the head of your document so that when a site is showing up on an iPhone specifically, it will show the responsively designed version and not just a shrunken version of your site. So that's it. This is a very general introduction to responsive design. You will have to spend a lot more time adding lots more rules for media queries, spending time seeing exactly how your site works when you're doing fluid layouts, when you're adding percentage widths. As your site gets more complicated with more divs and divs inside of divs, you'll have more elements to change for responsive design. So just take your time. This is just a very basic overview with it, and you'll get more experience with this as you start working with responsively designed frameworks like Bootstrap or a responsive designed template for WordPress.